Hi everyone, my name's Catherine and I'm going to be providing a feminist perspective on King Lear. And this was achieved via the critic Catherine Cox, who wrote an excellent thing in Women, Virgos and Viragos in King Lear. So I really recommend reading that because it gives a lot of insight into an argument centered around Cordelia if you wanted to do that, or if you wanted to direct your students to do that. But this is a little bit of background information that might help you going into it. So the first thing you want to start off with is looking at the context of Jacobean Christianity. So this is just after Queen Elizabeth has died and King James has come to the throne. So there are a few tensions with that as well. A male king after a female king, so after a female queen. So as you might assume, it might be a little bit more patriarchal. Of course, it was still deeply patriarchal when Elizabeth was in control, but now we've got a male king. So a few tensions happening there. He also was originally the King of Scotland, and he wanted to unify Scotland and England and essentially create Britain. So when we look at a divided kingdom in King Lear, how he gives certain parts to his daughters, it's a similar thing to what's going on in terms of the context as well, where England and Scotland, they're separate areas, but King James wants to unify them. Whereas in King Lear, they're separate, and the separation is what also causes chaos. So a little bit allegorical in a sense. But King James was a Protestant, and this is written, and he ruled about 100 years after the Reformation, but there are a few flow-on effects, of course. But he wrote the King James translation of the Bible, which was the first ever translation of the Bible into English. This was radical because the invention of the printing press allowed this translation to become widespread, and it allowed Christianity to spread all across the world. As a result, there are a few doctrines or ideas that were becoming more widespread across England as well. One of these is the idea of the great chain of being, which is a theological principle or a religious paradigm or pattern of thinking, which dictated that women are essentially subordinate to men. It was a hierarchy that is not necessarily followed really anymore, but it was a hierarchy of all living things. So there was like God at the top and all living things underneath that, so like God, angels, men, kings, men, etc. But some patriarchal doctrines were being enforced at the time, of course, and a few verses that kind of stand out in relation to this text is the one from Ephesians, which says, "Let women be subject to their men as to the Lord." And another from Timothy, which says, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." So these notions of silence are really particularly important when it comes to Cordelia. So just keep those in mind. But then also, in terms of the context of patriarchy at the time, there are these ideas of paternalistic roles or fatherly roles. And it's this idea that a father must have absolute authority and control over his daughters, or else chaos will ensue, because in order to maintain the patriarchy, women must be subdued or oppressed. So one of the core issues in King Lear is that Lear does not fulfill those paternalistic or patriarchal duties, and Cordelia does not fulfill her feminine ones. So Lear hands over his power to his daughters, not to his sons because he doesn't have any, but daughters, which already there's a disruption of the great chain of being there, because he does not want the burden of ruling anymore. He literally says that the reason that he wants to abdicate his throne is to shake all cares and business from our age, conferring them on younger strengths while we, unburdened, crawl towards death. So that's essentially saying that he's a little bit lazy. He doesn't want to keep on ruling anymore because he feels like he's too old and he wants to crawl unburdened until death. So he just wants to have a peaceful rest of his life, essentially. But according to this context, he shouldn't be giving his power to his daughters. So there's a tension happening there already. And Goneril and Regan, of course, manipulate and betray him. So they strip him of his authority, and that starts with Goneril challenging her father's power by demanding he dismisses half of his knights in Act 1, Scene 4. So of course, this is the notion of a misbehaving woman, and if a woman misbehaves, they should be punished. If anyone misbehaves, essentially in this context, they should be punished. But especially if a woman actively goes against a man's control, that's bad, because again, you're disrupting the idea of the great chain of being. And in this time, they're very fixated about order and control. So if this order is disrupted, bad things will happen, chaos will ensue. But where I think it's particularly interesting is through the character of Cordelia, because her storyline provides a more nuanced approach to, or a more nuanced feminist approach to the text, rather than just through the villains, which is also completely great to look at the Machiavellianism of Goneril and Regan, and then also Edmund if you want to as well. But this can be a little bit more interesting if you want to go this route. Cordelia refuses to profess her love in Act 1, Scene 1, when the love test occurs. So she says in an aside, which means she's speaking directly to the audience. There's other people on the stage, but they can't hear her. She says, "What shall Cordelia speak? Love and be silent." So if you remember those verses I showed you earlier, it's very reminiscent of the one from Timothy, where he says that she must be silent and there must be quietness and full submission. And this is a way of women, again, at the time, showing their love, not necessarily for men, but also for God generally. Just being silent in this context doesn't necessarily apply now to Christianity, but back then. So it draws on this patriarchal Bible verse, conveying her alignment with Christian tradition. But when she refuses her father's order to speak, these are direct quotes from Act 1, Scene 1, and replies with nothing, she refuses patriarchal control, therefore assuming masculine characteristics by being outspoken, and betraying the great chain of being, therefore God as well, and must be ostracized or kicked out from her family. So King Lear does disown her for a time. So in Cox's essay, she talks about this dichotomy between Virgo and Virago, where Virgo as a term refers to the Virgin Mary, or this perfect woman, and the Virago, the misbehaving, loud, or overbearing woman. So this is like the Virgin Mary versus Eve dichotomy. So yeah, kind of good versus evil, misbehaving versus perfect, Virgin and Madonna, well, Madonna and whole complex. So it's kind of interesting because Cordelia embodies both. And that, in my opinion anyway, is kind of indicative of the labile status of women in society more broadly. But also Cordelia, she's not just one thing. She's not just a perfect woman. She also has some form of agency. If only a little bit, she does have some. And so in defying her father's orders to profess her love, she is maybe being a good Christian because she is, love and be silent. And she's also deeply humble. And that's what the Bible teaches. But in this context, we've got the patriarchal control aspect. And because she's going against her father, that's not a positive thing. So Shakespeare is going to have to put her back in her place eventually. But giving her a moment of liberation, of course, and kind of an audience at the time would be watching her and thinking, she shouldn't defy her father, but also she's embodying all these good Christian characteristics. Like she's genuinely a good person. So a little bit of attention appears there too, right? Because it's like we watch her and we think, wow, she's kind of admirable in a way. And also when she rides back and saves King Lear, she's deeply admirable. But she is refusing patriarchal control. So can a woman be a good Christian and be a good person and a good woman, but also defy patriarchal control? And this is kind of the dialogue that Shakespeare is presenting in this play. But when she comes back into Lear's life and saves him, he says, "Be your tears wet. Yes, faith, pray do not weep." In Act 5, Scene 1. So she's crying, and tears are a sign of feminine repentance. So very reminiscent of in the Bible, Mary Magdalene, or it doesn't actually say her name in the Bible, but this woman cries on Jesus's feet as a form of repentance. So interesting kind of dialogue happening there, where there's this form of repentance happening, and it's through through crying. So she's kind of saying, I'm sorry that I denied your control. Ironically, though, at the same time, King Lear is also apologizing in this quote. I didn't include the full thing, but later in the quote, he apologizes and alludes to Jesus on the cross. So there's more to be pulled out of there, of course, too. And then when she dies, there's this stage direction saying enter Lear through opening in RH with Cordelia dead in his arms. So this imagery here is very reminiscent of the Pietà, but the genders are reversed. The Pietà is this artwork here where Mary is holding the dead body of Jesus. So interesting that the genders are reversed there. But it's this idea, perhaps, that self-sacrifice is innately feminine. Cordelia is finally silenced, and order is therefore restored, and Lear loves her again because she is silenced, or that's part of the reason, of course. But because of his own transgressions betraying patriarchal order, Lear must also die, and does so with a broken heart. So as you can see, the order of the great chain of being is ultimately restored, because Shakespeare had to do that, or he might have been beheaded by the monarch at the time, King James, or the people in power. They wouldn't like him if he completely left it ambiguous. But interesting to think about this kind of argument of gender that comes throughout the play. Yeah, thank you.